Senator from Arizona.
Thank you, Madam President. I ask, first of all, that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
And that I be allowed to speak as if in morning business for up to 10 minutes.
Without objection.
Thank you. Madam President, I've been coming to the floor to discuss why free enterprise is morally superior to all other economic systems. Morally superior. I've explored how free enterprise promotes the pursuit of happiness, properly understood, by emphasizing earned success, and how it lifts up the poor by raising living standards. Today I want to look at another way free enterprise lifts up the poor, by promoting the moral principles that make people more charitable and more socially responsible. This perspective sharply contrasts with President Obama's campaign narrative about social responsibility. He and many of his supporters paint free enterprise as a system that inherently clashes with social responsibility. In his telling, free enterprise is a system that mainly promotes Gordon Gekko-style greed and riches for those who least deserve them, a system that must be reformed through higher taxes and larger government. Most of the policies he's supported during the last 3 years demonstrate this perspective. The size and scope of the federal government has increased dramatically during his presidency. As he campaigns to get reelected, his main theme is that the only way some Americans can do better is if the government makes others worse off. There's an important counter-argument to this negative narrative. In a new book called The Road to Freedom, American Enterprise Institute President Arthur Brooks provides a comprehensive explanation of the morality of free enterprise and how it makes everyone better off by creating a more positive society. As Brooks writes, the principles that underpin free enterprise are moral principles, such as honesty, industriousness, thrift, and opportunity. Those principles make people more virtuous, not less. Participants in free enterprise, for example, must be able to trust those with whom they do business, that they will honor their contracts. By promoting greater trust and integrity, free markets promote the social and psychological linchpin of democratic prosperity. Brooks elaborates, and I quote, "The free enterprise system requires a culture of optimism and trust to function correctly, a positive sum, win-win mentality, and a desire for everyone to be better off. Everyone to be better off. For many people, it produces more prosperity than they need to meet their daily requirements, a surplus that they will choose to direct to charitable purposes." End of quotation. The prosperity and positive outlook that stem from free enterprise encourages people to help the neediest and most vulnerable members of society. Indeed, it is no coincidence that the United States is a more charitable country than those with bigger welfare states. Those who believe in and have benefited from the free enterprise system believe that everyone should have the opportunity to prosper, and they're willing to help take responsibility for lifting others up. Charitable giving appears to be part of most Americans' DNA, Arthur Brooks writes. Americans are remarkably generous, not only toward our fellow citizens, but those suffering abroad as well. On a per capita basis, we give 3.5 times as much to causes and charities as the French, 7 times as much as the Germans, and 14 times as much as Italians. These findings correlate to volunteering as well. 70 to 80% of Americans donate money to charity each year. These donations add up to about $300 billion annually. The money goes to religious causes and also to secular activities such as education, health care, and social welfare. Americans also donate large amounts of their time to help the less fortunate among us. Indeed, there is a strong correlation between beliefs about the size of government and attitudes toward giving. As Brooks shows, those who believe in limited government give more to charity than those who hold more statist views. That makes sense. After all, a statist might argue that paying high levels of taxation is the equivalent of giving a lot to charity, since the government spends a large portion of its total revenue on social programs. By contrast, free marketers would argue that government spending tends to crowd out private charity in ways that are both socially and fiscally harmful. Americans take well-justified pride in their charitable giving. Both in aggregate and relative terms, we are the most generous society the world has ever known. As budget and tax debates move forward, we must remember that raising the top marginal tax rates could conceivably reduce charitable giving, because the biggest philanthropists would have less money to donate. This is just one of the many unintended and undesirable consequences that could result from the massive tax hike that's scheduled to take effect at the end of this year. If excessively high rates of taxation were the best way to cultivate a more generous and socially conscious citizenry, then Europeans would give more to charity than Americans. But that's simply not the case. America's record on charitable giving demonstrates that free enterprise is the best way to boost charitable giving and foster the civic virtues that underpin a broadly shared prosperity. Mr. President, I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll of the Senate.
Mr. Akaka.
Mr. President.
The senator from Kentucky.
Ask unanimous consent that we dispense with the quorum call.
Without objection, the senator is recognized.
Mr. President, the ordinary middle-class family is struggling to get a home loan. Tens of thousands of homeowners have lost their homes or are struggling to make payments on their home loans. Meanwhile, Congress steadily dishes out billions of dollars in taxpayer-subsidized loans to large, profitable companies. 80% of these loans, these export-import loans, are given to companies that are in the Fortune 500. So we're giving taxpayer loans to very profitable companies. I'm a great believer in capitalism, in the jobs that corporations create. I defend profit and the benefit that accrues from leaving that profit largely in the private sector. I'm not one who clamors for punitive taxes. I'm not someone who thinks we need to punish corporations. But at the same time, don't construe that to mean that I believe we should be subsidizing profitable corporations. I don't think taxpayer-subsidized loans should go to profitable companies. Now, President Obama has been passing out loans to his campaign donors. He's been using a campaign trough that he has set up over at the Department of Energy. Very wealthy multi-millionaires and billionaires are getting loans through the Department of Energy. Solyndra, BrightSource, people heavily involved in the president's campaign have been getting subsidized loans. Republicans have been rightly criticizing the president for these loans, for these Department of Energy loans to Solyndra, BrightSource, and others. Republicans have been correct in criticizing the president for trying to pick the winners and losers in the energy production. Yet now, a majority of the Republicans are poised to vote for their own set of taxpayer-subsidized loans to the Export-Import Bank. In fact, they want to increase the export-import loans by nearly 50% and pick the winners and losers now in the export business. The horse traders may disdain consistency, but the American people value principled and consistent opposition to deficit financing. The American people know hypocrisy when they see it. The American people know corporate welfare when they see it. The Ex-Import Bank, in fact, provided an $18 million loan to a steel mill in China. Our steel industry has been in decline for decades, and we loan $18 million to our competitors? Who in their right mind would subsidize our Chinese competitors with loans? It makes no sense. Can you think of anything more insulting than loaning money to our competitors? Well, come to think of it, I might. We actually give foreign aid to China. We actually send China economic development assistance. Is it any wonder that Congress has an 11% approval rating? Many Americans are trying to hang on to their homes, struggling to make their payments on their own home mortgage, while very profitable big business is being given subsidized loans by the government. It makes no sense. What gives? To add insult to injury, we are borrowing money from the same countries that we are lending the money to. So we borrow money from India because we run a deficit of over $1 trillion a year. We borrow money from India, and then we're sending it back to them in the form of taxpayer-subsidized loans. It makes no sense. Ex-Im loans, like the loans to Solyndra and BrightSource, are simply forms of crony capitalism. With trillion-dollar annual deficits, surely we can vote to end corporate welfare. If companies are making billions of dollars in profit, can we at least end the welfare that we're sending to these corporations? I urge a vote against reauthorizing the Ex-Im Bank, and I hope my Republican colleagues will see the inconsistency of criticizing the president on one hand for his crony capitalism and then turning around and doing the same thing. So I support not reauthorizing the Export-Import Bank, admitting that it's corporate welfare, and trying to save the taxpayer some of their hard-earned money. Thank you very much, Mr. President, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
President,
Senator from Utah.
I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection, the senator is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise today to discuss the Western Economic Security Act, the WEST Act, which I recently introduced with my good friend and colleague from Wyoming, Senator Barrasso. This bill is an outgrowth of our work with the Senate Western Caucus and the Congressional Western Caucus. These groups, which include my good friend from Utah, Congressman Rob Bishop, and Congressman Steve Pierce from New Mexico, are truly leading the way. We've been doing the hard work of identifying solutions that will promote job creation, boost America's energy production, and put our nation on a better fiscal footing by encouraging economic growth. We keep hearing from the Democrat leadership that Congress is dysfunctional. That may be, but it is not because of a lack of good ideas. It is because, in an effort to help the President in his re-election and shield vulnerable Democrats, the decision was made to promote politically motivated show votes rather than sound job-creating legislation. Americans don't want higher taxes in the name of redistribution and government-dictated fairness. They don't want bureaucrats in Washington figuring out how to spread the wealth around, as then-candidate Obama did or put it in 2008. What they want is economic opportunity and the security that comes with it. They want the freedom and opportunity to pursue new ventures, start new businesses, and save for their retirement and for their children's education. If the Democratic leadership ever decides to listen to the American people and advance reasonable legislation to grow the economy and create jobs, they could start with this WEST Act. The WEST Act is a sound and solid bill, one that puts together some of the best ideas identified by the Western caucuses. And my hope is that it will meet with bipartisan support here in the Senate. This bill could not come at a better time. The proposals in the WEST Act will go a long way toward generating the employment and economic growth that citizens and taxpayers are longing for. The proposals in the WEST Act should not be controversial here in the Senate. The President claimed that his trillion-dollar stimulus would create or save millions of American jobs. As it turned out, this was a hollow promise. But the WEST Act is the real deal. And if the President and his party are serious about stimulating the economy, this legislation is a good way to do it and a good place to start. The 8 bills that Senator Barrasso and I have included in this WEST Act have all passed the House of Representatives. They are common-sense, pro-growth policies, and I am confident that these proposals, if put to the vote of the American people, would pass overwhelmingly. They certainly would in my home state of Utah. They should pass the Senate as well. The bill has 3 main objectives. First, we are going to put America back to work by producing more American energy. Our bill ends the Obama administration's de facto moratorium on drilling in the Gulf of Mexico in a safe, responsible, and transparent manner. We set firm guidelines for considering permits to drill, and we require the administration to move forward promptly to conduct offshore lease sales that have been delayed or canceled in the Gulf and Outer Continental Shelf. The WEST Act sets a production goal of 3 million barrels of oil per day by 2027, reducing foreign imports by nearly 1/3. And at a time when every job counts, our bill would produce thousands of high-paying jobs. Second, our bill will help bring down energy prices, making it easier for Americans to drive their cars and heat their homes. We could produce over 1 million barrels of oil a day with our bill's elimination of confusion and uncertainty surrounding the EPA's decision-making process for clean air permits. The bill prohibits the EPA administrator from promulgating any regulation that takes into consideration the emission of a greenhouse gas in order to address climate change using the Clean Air Act. And third, our bill will protect agriculture by reducing unnecessary regulatory burdens. It amends the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, or FIFRA, to ensure that national pollutant discharge elimination systems permits are not needed for the application of pesticides that are currently registered and regulated under FIFRA. This provision of the bill will also ensure that diseases like the West Nile virus can be managed through mosquito abatement. It is very important for communities in Utah to be able to address these issues without constantly seeking approval from federal overlords. The bill also stops the EPA from imposing more stringent dust standards each year for 1 year. Additionally, it would afford states and localities the flexibility to address any rural dust issues before the federal government would have the authority to do so. For the life of me, I do not understand the administration's stance on energy production. The Department of Energy claims that there are more than 800 billion barrels of recoverable oil in oil shale in Utah, Wyoming, and Colorado. This is more than the proven reserves of Saudi Arabia. If we were able to develop this resource the way we are capable of doing, we could have a major impact on the jobless rate as well as the cost of energy in our country. Last month, one of the largest oil companies in the world announced a $200 million investment in a commercial demonstration project for oil shale. The project will be in my home state using technology developed by a Utah company. Another major company that has been successfully developing commercial oil shales for more than 80 years is opening offices in Salt Lake City and seeking permits for a very large facility in my home state of Utah. The state of Utah, local governments, and the businesses and the business community support the development of these resources. Yet the President and his administration are working to stop this at all costs. The most recent roadblock was the rewriting of the final 2008 three-state programmatic impact statement to cut back by more than 70% the federal lands available for oil shale and oil sands development. Well, I believe strongly that Interior Secretary Salazar has no authority whatsoever to take that action. I recently heard from an energy company in Utah that it is easier to do business in Somalia than it is in the United States. Unfortunately, that is not a surprising sentiment, but that is what we have come to expect from President Obama. He talks a big game about fairness when it comes to raising taxes, but his energy policies are both regressive and elitist. In the interest of appealing to the environmental interests of his wealthy supporters, the administration leaves middle-class people behind. Obstructing domestic energy production prevents the creation of high-paying jobs that provide good wages for families. And it fails to bring down the high cost of fuel that hits middle and lower-income families the hardest. In fact, President Obama's energy agenda tops the list of pernicious policies that hurt American families, hinder economic growth, and harm businesses by dramatically raising the costs of everyday life. The administration's position is clear. The President wants to drive up the cost of gasoline and drive Americans out of their cars. In 2008, when the President still harbored grandiose plans of changing the course of world history, his Energy Secretary Chu said that his goal was to, quote, boost the price of gasoline to the levels in Europe, unquote. In the meantime, the President and his party suffered a humiliating defeat in the 2010 elections, and now, faced with the prospect of going the way of President Carter this fall, the administration is trying to walk back this position. With voters facing $4 a gallon gasoline, Secretary Chu now claims he is doing everything he can to reduce the price of energy. And the President's advisors are suggesting that this is just a gotcha quote. It isn't. It represents the real view of the President and those in his bubble. The price of gasoline was no big deal to the President prior to being elected to the Senate and the White House. His short commute from his Hyde Park house to the University of Chicago might not even have required a car. His wealthiest supporters, those being appealed to with his anti-energy agenda, do not spend a significant amount of their income on gasoline. And when Warren Buffett flies in his private jet to meet with the President to discuss plans for raising taxes on small businesses, he is not worried about the cost of jet fuel. But for families that are now spending nearly $100 to fill up their cars, the cost of gasoline is a big deal. Members of the President's party seem to get this. Even here in the Senate, we see Democrat support for the President's decision to hold up the Keystone pipeline collapsing. And for good reason. The President's unilateral decision to kill that project might play well at Midtown Manhattan fundraisers, where wealthy elites have the luxury of supporting a radical environmental agenda without worrying about the real-world consequences of that agenda for the middle class. But it was bad for jobs, bad for the economy, and bad for American families. Mr. President, President Obama has said that he wants to find an all-of-the-above approach to energy production. He need look no further than the West Act. And having said that, I would like to personally compliment my dear friend and colleague, Senator Barrasso from Wyoming. He's the leader of our Western Caucus, and frankly, we couldn't have a better leader. And he understands these issues very, very well. We in the West understand that we have an obligation and we have the ability to be able to help this country from an energy standpoint in ways that it needs help. We have the ability to be able to help save this country, and we intend to do so. This West Act would be a very good step in that direction. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Wyoming.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, today I rise to echo the comments made by my colleague, Senator Orrin Hatch of Utah. Mr. President, throughout Senator Hatch's distinguished career, he has served this Senate and this nation in a number of major leadership capacities. I am most grateful for his ongoing leadership and the position that he has taken in the Senate Western Caucus, that of being chairman of the caucus's Subcommittee on Public Lands. Senator Hatch, along with Senator Moran and I, have laid out a clear path to energy security and to job creation. The bill is called the Western Energy Security Today Act, or the WEST Act. President Obama told Congress that he would, and he said, quote, keep trying every new idea that works, he said, and he went on to say he would listen to every good proposal, no matter which party comes up with it. Well, Western Republicans last year laid out a clear path to energy security and job creation for the Western United States and for the country. It is called the Jobs Frontier Report, breaking down Washington's barriers to America's red, white, and blue jobs. Mr. President, President Obama should listen to and embrace the findings in this report. The House of Representatives has passed key pieces of legislation over the past year from this Jobs Frontier Report. These are pieces of legislation that will begin to generate quality jobs and increase U.S. energy production. These bills tackle key critical issues, such as encouraging energy exploration and production, removing unnecessary EPA regulations. This legislation would create thousands, Mr. President, thousands of jobs for Americans. The WEST Act contains language from 8 of these bills already passed by the House that were part of the Jobs Frontier original report. This legislation accomplishes many of the goals of the Jobs Frontier report. It does it by increasing affordable American energy. It does it by promoting agriculture and ranching. And it does it by overturning Washington's regulatory overreach. The bottom line is that this act is ready to create jobs now, today, and to set the nation on the path to becoming more energy secure. So I'm here, Mr. President, to congratulate Senator Hatch for bringing this important bill forward, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, I want to thank my colleague from Wyoming. He's been such a great addition to the United States Senate. He has an intimate knowledge of Western lands and their productivity and what they could do if we were given the opportunity. And he's just an all-around good human being. So I feel very, very grateful for his leadership. And I really express my support for his leadership of the Western Caucus. He is one of the finest people here. And I just personally want to thank him for his kind remarks and that he's just made. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, I'd like unanimous consent to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection, the senator is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. President, earlier this week, the Conference Committee on the Surface Transportation Reauthorization, more commonly known as the Highway Bill, met for its initial meeting. In the opening remarks that were made on Tuesday, it was encouraging that there seemed to be a general agreement on how important that transportation bill is to our nation. As I will describe later, it's 2.9 million jobs that are associated with this bill. I should be specific and say 2.9 million job years, since those jobs do not extend for eternity. But it's the most important piece of jobs legislation we could consider. I appreciated hearing from the senator from Utah about the jobs concern of his